Look around the world today, and you'll notice one thing: Gen Z is not staying silent. From Dhaka to Jakarta, from Nairobi to Paris, this generation has turned the streets into classrooms of resistance. They've shown us that they won't accept injustice quietly, and they'll fight back even if it costs them dearly. The most striking example? Just years ago from now in Bangladesh, a student-led revolution shook the nation to its core. Thousands poured into the streets against an unfair quota system demanding merit over privilege. The clashes were brutal. Official figures say nearly 1,000 lives lost, but independent reports suggest the number could be closer to 3,000. It's one of the deadliest student uprisings in modern history, and it was led almost entirely by Gen Z. Now, this isn't just about Bangladesh. Across the last few years, we've seen young people, mostly born between the late 90s and early 2010s, taking the front lines in Nepal, Kenya, Indonesia, Iran, and beyond. And they all seem to share one thing: an unshakable belief that injustice should never be tolerated. In this video, we're going to dive deep into this question. Is Gen Z really a protestative and aggressive generation who will never tolerate injustice? To answer it, we'll walk through the biggest Gen Z-led movements of recent years, analyze their nature, their victories, their resilience, and yes, their sacrifices. So let's start the video. Before we dive into the movements, let's set the stage. Gen Z usually refers to people born roughly between 1997 and 2012. That means today, in 2025, they're anywhere from early teens to late 20s. They're digital natives, people who grew up with the internet, social media, and instant information. Unlike earlier generations, they don't wait for newspapers or TV anchors to tell them what's happening. They record it themselves, share it live, and mobilize their peers in real time. Now, because of this connectivity and exposure, they've also developed a mindset that's very different. They are skeptical of authority, quick to challenge corruption, and deeply sensitive to issues of fairness. And when they feel something is unjust, they don't sit quietly. They take action. Sometimes that action is online, and sometimes it explodes onto the streets. Let's begin with Bangladesh, because this movement is perhaps the clearest example of Gen Z's fearless mentality. In July 2025, the country erupted over a controversial quota system for government jobs. Students argued that the system unfairly favored certain groups and shut the door on merit-based candidates. For a nation with a young population and limited job opportunities, this wasn't just about quotas, it was about their future. The protests began in Dhaka, but quickly spread nationwide. Within days, millions of students, most of them from Gen Z, were marching in the streets. What started as peaceful demonstrations escalated after heavy-handed crackdowns. Universities turned into battlegrounds. Videos on TikTok and X showed students facing tear gas, rubber bullets, and even live fire. The death toll is staggering. Officially, the government admits to around 1,000 deaths, but human rights groups and independent journalists estimate the real number to be closer to 3,000. Think about that. Thousands of students killed in just a few weeks, and yet, the movement did not die. Instead, it grew stronger. This is where we see the essence of Gen Z's protestative nature. Despite the violence, they kept organizing. They created encrypted chat groups, used VPNs to bypass internet shutdowns, and shared footage to the world even when mainstream media was censored. Eventually, the pressure became unbearable, and the government had no choice but to step back. The quota reform was scrapped, and the political landscape of Bangladesh was shaken to its core. The Bangladesh movement tells us something powerful. Gen Z's resilience is unmatched. Where older generations may have given up after such brutal repression, Gen Z doubled down, driven by the belief that if they don't fight now, their future will be stolen forever. Now let's move north to Nepal. In early 2025, the government made a shocking move. It banned TikTok and later extended the ban to Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and WhatsApp. For Gen Z, this wasn't just about losing entertainment. Social media was their voice, their platform, their lifeline. Within days, thousands of young Nepalese poured into the streets of Kathmandu and other cities. The protests were fueled almost entirely by Gen Z, who felt the government was trying to silence them. What's unique here is how fast the movement spread. Even without the platforms, students used VPNs, offline networks, and even word of mouth to mobilize. The protests became so intense that several top ministers resigned, and the government was forced to reverse parts of the ban. Here again, we see the Gen Z pattern. When pushed into a corner, they refuse to accept silence. Their strong mentality is built around defending their space, whether it's political, social, or digital. In Africa, we saw a similar story. In Kenya, the death of TikTok influencer Brian Chira in March 2024 sparked outrage. He was just 23 years old, a Gen Z voice who had gained millions of followers. When news spread that his death involved police brutality and negligence, young Kenyans erupted. What followed was a wave of protests, unlike anything the country had seen in years. Tens of thousands of youth marched across Nairobi and other cities demanding justice and accountability. The unique thing here? The protests were leaderless. No political party, no central figure, just Gen Z, mobilized through hashtags like #JusticeForChira. The movement forced a public inquiry into police conduct and revived debates about corruption and youth unemployment. It showed that Gen Z doesn't just protest for abstract issues, they rally for people they identify with, people who represent their own struggles. Let's move to Indonesia. Back in 2019, students protested against new laws that weakened the Anti-Corruption Commission and threatened civil liberties. These protests were dubbed Reformasi di Korupsi, or the Reform Corrupted Movement. By 2020 and later in 2022, the protests came back even stronger under the banner of Indonesia Gelap, or Dark Indonesia. What made these protests stand out was the creativity. Gen Z protesters wore black clothing, used memes, music, and viral hashtags to rally support. They even coordinated flash protests in malls and public squares, making it nearly impossible for the police to control them. The outcome? The government was forced to amend parts of the controversial laws and delay others. Again, we see Gen Z's trademark: they are indefatigable. They may not always win everything, but they chip away at injustice until change happens. And of course, we can't forget Iran. In September 2022, 22-year-old Mahsa Amini died in custody after being arrested for allegedly violating hijab laws. Her death triggered protests across Iran, but the backbone of those demonstrations was Gen Z, students and young women who had grown tired of strict rules and lack of freedom. Despite internet shutdowns, arrests, and brutal crackdowns, they kept chanting Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom. At least 500 protesters were killed and thousands jailed. But the movement left an irreversible mark on Iranian society. Even if the regime survived, the mindset of a whole generation had shifted. This pattern isn't limited to one region. In the US, Gen Z students have walked out of classrooms to protest school shootings, calling for stricter gun laws. In Europe, millions joined climate strikes led by teenagers, pushing governments to declare climate emergencies. In Sri Lanka, youth protests against economic collapse in 2022 were key to forcing the president's resignation. In every corner of the globe, we see the same trend. Gen Z doesn't quietly endure injustice. They confront it, loudly, directly, and often at great personal cost. So is Gen Z a protestative and aggressive generation who will never tolerate injustice? Based on everything we've seen, the answer is yes. They are impatient with excuses, allergic to corruption, and armed with tools that make them more powerful than any generation before. But here's the deeper truth. Their aggression isn't blind. It's born out of necessity. When faced with rigged systems, shrinking opportunities, and corrupt elites, Gen Z has chosen not to be victims. They've chosen to be fighters. And history may very well remember them as the generation that refused to stay silent, the generation that turned protest into a global language, and the generation that proved, once and for all, that injustice will not go unchallenged.